The maternal bond is often described as the most foundational architecture of human society. It is a biological imperative, a complex psychological and biological mechanism believed to ensure the survival of the most vulnerable. In the American legal system, this bond historically created a form of implicit protection known as the chivalry hypothesis, a criminological theory suggesting that women, particularly biological mothers, were often viewed as inherently nurturing and therefore less capable of intentional harm. However, as final judgments were handed down in courtrooms across the country in 2025, that assumption did not merely weaken, it collapsed. This was the year the American justice system shifted its focus away from the maternal myth and toward forensic reality. Courts examined cases in which belief systems were used to emotionally detach from children, cases where missing person reports were used as misdirection, and an emerging pattern in which digital evidence revealed critical delays in seeking help during what investigators now call fatal windows of care. In this investigation, we take you inside the most consequential maternal crime cases to reach final resolution in 2025. We move case by case, examining investigative timelines, behavioral patterns, and the documented moments where intervention could have changed outcomes, but did not. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today, what time it is there, and what the weather looks like outside. These cases reach far beyond local headlines, and we want to see just how far these stories of accountability have traveled. This deep dive investigation is based on thousands of pages of public records, appellate rulings, and 2025 sentencing transcripts. To support the level of research required for this kind of documentary reporting, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It's the simplest way to help keep these cases in the public record. Case 1, Rachel Henry, Arizona. The interview room inside the Phoenix Police Department was unusually quiet on February 14, 2025. While much of the country marked Valentine's Day, 27-year-old Rachel Henry was escorted into a Maricopa County courtroom to receive a sentence that would determine whether she would ever live outside a correctional facility again. At first glance, Rachel did not resemble the figure described in national headlines. She appeared physically exhausted, like many young parents managing multiple children under the age of 4. But the record presented during her sentencing hearing, concluding a 5-year legal process, revealed what the court described as a deliberate and sustained violation of parental responsibility. Judge Jeffrey Fish would later characterize the case as one of the most difficult he had encountered in his judicial career. The events that led to this outcome began on the afternoon of January 20, 2020, at a residence near 24th Street and Baseline Road in South Phoenix. According to probable cause documents and a confession later entered into evidence, investigators determined that the children's deaths occurred over a period of time, rather than as a single impulsive incident. Court filings indicate that Rachel engaged in conduct that caused fatal harm to her 3 children, 1-year-old Maria, 3-year-old Zane, and 7-month-old Catalea. Prosecutors emphasized during sentencing that there were multiple interruptions and pauses throughout the timeline. These moments, they argued, demonstrated awareness and opportunity for intervention. At several points, family members were present in the home. Despite this, no request for medical assistance was made. Investigators testified that the scene inside the residence appeared arranged in a manner that initially suggested the children were asleep. It was only after a relative attempted to wake one of them that emergency services were contacted. By the time first responders arrived, all 3 children had been pronounced deceased. In December 2024, Rachel Henry entered a guilty plea to 3 counts of premeditated first-degree murder. The plea agreement removed the possibility of capital punishment, but it did not eliminate the most severe sentencing alternative available under Arizona law. During the February sentencing hearing, the defense presented mitigating factors, including substance addiction, mental health struggles, and postpartum depression. Her attorney acknowledged that while these factors provided context, they did not absolve responsibility. Prosecutors focused instead on what they referred to as sequential decision-making. They argued that the spacing of events, the absence of a call for help, and the staging of the scene collectively supported a finding of intent rather than panic or confusion. Judge Fish addressed Rachel directly before imposing sentence. "I have dedicated my career to protecting children," he stated. "It is difficult to comprehend how a parent could cause the death of their own." He then sentenced Rachel Henry to 3 consecutive natural life terms in the Arizona Department of Corrections. Under state law, and the sentence carries no eligibility for parole, work release, or reduction. Rachel Henry will remain incarcerated for the remainder of her life. The court record closed with 3 names permanently entered into Arizona's legal history: Zane, Mireya, and Catalaya. Case 2, Lori Vallow Daybell, Arizona. If Case 1 centered on a breakdown within a single household, Case 2 unfolded as a multi-state legal reckoning shaped by ideology, influence, and coordinated decision-making. On July 25, 2025, a Phoenix courtroom became the final Arizona venue for 52-year-old Lori Vallow Daybell, a defendant whose name had already become nationally recognized following prior life sentences in Idaho. Although she was already serving multiple life terms connected to the 2019 deaths of her children, through J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan, the Arizona proceedings addressed a broader legal question: whether her actions in that state demonstrated participation in a wider criminal conspiracy. Prosecutors described the case not simply as a series of isolated incidents, but as the product of an internally constructed belief system that gradually replaced conventional moral boundaries. During trial, thousands of pages of digital communications, including iCloud archives, text exchanges, and financial records, were introduced to illustrate how that worldview developed and how it influenced decision-making. At the center of the prosecution's theory was a so-called light and dark rating framework. Individuals within Lori's personal circle were assigned spiritual classifications and numerical values. Behavioral experts testified that this labeling system functioned as a psychological distancing tool, allowing ordinary relationships to be reinterpreted as cosmic conflicts. Messages presented to the jury showed discussions about individuals who were described as spiritually compromised or obstructive to a perceived divine mission. Prosecutors argued these labels were not symbolic language, but precursors to real-world actions. One of the central Arizona charges stemmed from the July 2019 death of Lori's 4th husband, Charles Vallow, at her Chandler residence. Initially characterized as self-defense by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, the event was later re-examined through forensic review and digital timeline reconstruction. During the 2025 proceedings, medical experts and investigators testified that the physical evidence and communication records were inconsistent with the original account. Data presented in court indicated that emergency services were not contacted immediately following the incident. Instead, digital timestamps showed activity inconsistent with a crisis response. Prosecutors argued that the delay, when combined with prior messages and documented disputes, supported a finding of coordinated intent rather than spontaneous confrontation. The Arizona case also resolved charges connected to an October 2019 attack on Brandon Boudreau, the former husband of Lori's niece. Brandon survived the incident. Evidence introduced at trial suggested pre-planning, including vehicle modifications, indirect communication methods, and subsequent attempts to obscure involvement. Surveillance footage, cell phone data, and testimony from forensic analysts formed the backbone of the state's argument. Rather than focusing on isolated acts, prosecutors framed the pattern as systematic removal of perceived obstacles. One of the most unusual aspects of the trial was Lori's decision to represent herself. Without formal legal training, she cross-examined witnesses and addressed the court directly. Transcripts show that her questioning frequently veered into ideological assertions rather than evidentiary challenges, resulting in repeated judicial interventions. Throughout the proceedings, Lori maintained that her actions were spiritually justified and that those identified as victims had transitioned into another state of existence. And prosecutors countered that such statements demonstrated detachment from accountability rather than diminished responsibility. On July 25, 2025, after reviewing extensive documentary evidence and victim impact statements, Judge Justin Bareski delivered sentencing. He described the pattern of conduct as deliberate, sustained, and rooted in personal belief elevated above legal obligation. He imposed 2 additional life sentences without the possibility of parole to run consecutively with her Idaho convictions. Family members addressed the court prior to sentencing, speaking about long-term emotional and financial consequences. Statements emphasized not only loss, but years of instability and manipulation preceding the legal outcome. The case also triggered policy discussions within Arizona. Lawmakers began reviewing expanded Son of Sam provisions to prevent individuals convicted in high-profile cases from profiting through media or publication deals. Under proposed measures, any such proceeds would be redirected to victims' families. With sentencing complete, Arizona formally concluded its role in one of the most complex multi-state conspiracy cases in recent memory. A case defined not only by personal belief systems, but by digital evidence, delayed intervention, and the legal limits of ideological defense. Case 3, Yui Inoue, Arizona. By May of 2025, the city of Tempe, Arizona, reached the legal conclusion of a case that had remained unresolved in the public conscience for nearly 4 years. 44-year-old Yui Inoue stood before a Maricopa County judge to receive sentencing for actions the court later described as deliberate and sustained. The events that led to this proceeding began in the early morning hours of May 15, 2021, at an apartment complex near Mill Avenue and Southern Avenue. Court records presented during the 2025 trial outlined escalating domestic conflict following a finalized divorce. Disputes over finances and relocation plans had intensified in the weeks prior. Shortly after midnight, Tempe police responded to a domestic disturbance call. Officers documented a heated argument and temporary property damage. After separating the parties and conducting a welfare check, officers observed the couple's 2 children, 9-year-old Mia and 7-year-old Kai, asleep in their beds. With no immediate indication of imminent danger, law enforcement cleared the scene. What occurred after officers departed became central to the prosecution's case. According to findings presented at trial, the children suffered fatal injuries sometime after police left the residence. Prosecutors emphasized that the timeline reflected a return to the children's room following a period of relative calm, arguing that this gap was critical in establishing intent rather than impulse. Medical testimony was delivered in clinical language, confirming that both children died as a result of intentional acts. Prosecutors focused less on the specific mechanics and more on behavioral sequencing, asserting that the spacing of events, combined with subsequent actions, demonstrated awareness and choice. The defense initially argued that Inoue experienced a psychological break. However, the prosecution introduced evidence suggesting organized, goal-directed conduct in the hours that followed. Investigators testified that the apartment had been secured, certain personal belongings were gathered, and preparations consistent with departure were underway. A backpack located inside Inoue's vehicle contained travel documents and cash. Prosecutors argued this indicated planning rather than confusion. Several hours later, Inoue arrived at a police substation and reported limited memory of the night's events. She suggested she had been influenced by internal voices. Prosecutors contrasted this claim with the documented sequence of actions preceding her arrival, arguing that the evidence reflected coherence rather than dissociation. The sentencing phase expanded beyond the immediate household. Mia and Kai were students in the Korean school district. School administrators addressed the court, describing the lasting impact on classmates and faculty. Counselors were brought in to assist students grappling with sudden loss. One former principal testified that helping children process the absence of friends was among the most difficult responsibilities of her career. In the months that followed, the school community created a memorial mural honoring the siblings. Teachers described ongoing conversations with students, attempting to understand permanence and grief. On May 2, 2025, a Maricopa County jury found Inoue guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder and related charges. She had waived her right to be present during portions of the trial. During sentencing, Inoue addressed the court and maintained that her children were still alive and residing elsewhere. A claim the judge noted directly contradicted the overwhelming forensic and testimonial record. Judge Jeffrey Reuter described the case as one involving deliberate harm compounded by subsequent concealment and evasion. He sentenced Yui Inoue to 2 consecutive natural life terms, plus additional years for the remaining convictions. Under Arizona law, a natural life sentence carries no possibility of parole. With that ruling, the court formally closed its role in a case that reshaped conversations about domestic conflict intervention, post-response risk assessment, and in the limits of early warning indicators. Case 4, LaShonda Wilder, Ohio. The afternoon of June 28, 2024, in the Milo Grogan neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio, began with what sounded like a parent in distress. 32-year-old LaShonda Wilder contacted emergency dispatch to report that her 8-year-old son, Martonio, had disappeared overnight. She stated that she had put him to bed around 9:30 p.m. and awoke to find the back door open. Wilder provided officers with descriptive details, including the clothing she believed her son had been wearing. She characterized him as emotionally volatile and prone to running away, framing that investigators would later identify as central to the initial narrative presented to law enforcement. Columbus police immediately initiated a missing child response. Officers canvassed the surrounding neighborhood, conducted door-to-door interviews, and coordinated aerial and ground search teams for hours. As the search intensified, detectives requested access to fully examine the residence. Court records later indicate that Wilder became increasingly resistant to certain investigative procedures. Her demeanor shifted from cooperative to evasive, and at one point she left the scene while the search remained active. Investigators ultimately redirected their focus to the residence itself. During a systematic interior review, officers located Martonio inside the home. The 2025 court proceedings revealed that Martonio had been deceased prior to the missing child report being filed. Prosecutors argued that the emergency call was not a plea for help, but an attempt to redirect suspicion and delay discovery. Medical testimony confirmed that the child's death resulted from intentional actions following a prolonged pattern of mistreatment and neglect. Experts described significant developmental concerns and long-term deprivation consistent with an unsafe living environment. Court records further revealed that the household had extensive prior contact with authorities. Law enforcement had responded to the address numerous times in the months leading up to the incident for domestic disturbances and welfare concerns. A dependency report filed several years earlier had documented elevated risk factors. Despite repeated system contact, no sustained intervention altered the child's living conditions. Prosecutors characterized the residence as an environment where instability had become normalized, and outside oversight had failed to produce protective change. In July 2025, LaShonda Wilder appeared in Franklin County Court for sentencing. She ultimately entered a guilty plea to charges including murder. In exchange, additional counts were dismissed. During the hearing, family members addressed the court, describing missed opportunities for intervention and expressing frustration that offers of assistance had not been accepted. The court also addressed the broader implications of false reporting. Prosecutors emphasized that the fabricated disappearance diverted significant public resources, including search personnel and emergency coordination, at a time when the truth was contained within the home itself. The judge sentenced LaShonda Wilder to life in prison with parole eligibility after 15 years, the maximum sentence permitted under Ohio law for the conviction. Her partner, Jonna Lowe, received an identical life sentence in related proceedings. The resolution of the Martonio Wilder case became not only a criminal judgment, but a case study in system saturation, illustrating how repeated contact with authorities does not always translate into effective intervention, and how a missing child narrative can be used to obscure responsibility rather than seek assistance. Case 5. Chelsea Duperon, Michigan. The quiet of a residential home on Phyllis Street in Wayne, Michigan, was interrupted on the morning of March 16, 2024, by an emergency call from 30-year-old Chelsea Renee Duperon, where she reported that her 8-year-old daughter, Lila Cassell, was not breathing. When officers arrived, they determined that Lila was unresponsive in her bedroom. Almost immediately, investigators observed circumstances that did not align with a sudden medical event. Detectives later testified that the scene raised questions inconsistent with the explanation initially provided. As questioning continued, Duperon's account shifted multiple times. She first suggested that Lila had experienced an accidental fall days earlier. When medical professionals indicated that the child's condition did not match that scenario, the explanation evolved again. Duperon began referencing spiritual influences and claimed that unseen forces had affected her household. Prosecutors later described this progression as an attempt to deflect responsibility. At one point, Duperon alleged that an unidentified woman had entered the home days earlier and harmed the child before disappearing. That claim was never substantiated. The 2025 court proceedings focused heavily on timeline reconstruction. Digital evidence, including store surveillance footage and transaction records, established that Lila's critical condition began on March 13th, 3 days before emergency services were contacted. During what investigators described as a fatal window of care, Duperon made routine retail purchases and did not seek medical assistance. Prosecutors emphasized that no calls were placed to doctors, emergency personnel, or extended family during that period. Duperon later stated that she believed Lila's condition was improving. Medical experts testified that the child's presentation would have required immediate professional intervention and that the delay significantly reduced the possibility of recovery. The medical examiner confirmed that Lila's death resulted from intentional acts rather than accidental injury. Prosecutors argued that the combination of shifting explanations, delayed medical care, and digital documentation demonstrated sustained decision-making rather than confusion. At the July 28, 2025 sentencing hearing, family members filled the courtroom. Assistant prosecutor Aaron Wilmoth described the case as a severe breach of parental duty centered on inaction during a preventable crisis. Judge Shiraz Anderson addressed the delay directly, noting that timely medical intervention on the day of injury likely would have changed the outcome. She stated that the court's review of medical documentation and investigative evidence supported a finding of prolonged and intentional harm. In her final statement, Duperon referred to Lila as the most perfect baby and expressed confusion about how events unfolded. Judge Anderson responded by emphasizing that the evidence showed repeated opportunities to seek help that were not taken. She sentenced Chelsea Duperon to 28 to 50 years in prison for second-degree murder. The court concluded that this case was defined not only by the initial act, but by the repeated decision not to intervene, transforming what may have been survivable into an irreversible outcome. Case 6, Sophia Williams, Georgia. The morning of March 6th, 2022, in unincorporated Decatur, Georgia, began with a report of a child not breathing. When officers from the DeKalb County Police Department arrived at an apartment complex on Trigoni Drive, they encountered a situation that would take more than 3 years to reach full legal resolution. Inside the residence, 4-year-old Anthony Weiss was unresponsive. Emergency medical personnel attempted life-saving measures, but he could not be revived. Investigators quickly determined that Anthony's death did not stem from a sudden medical event. Court proceedings later established that his condition reflected a pattern of escalating disciplinary conduct in the home. Anthony's biological mother, 41-year-old Sophia Williams, was identified as his primary caregiver. Initially, she suggested that an earlier accidental injury explained his condition. However, the investigation that followed, culminating in the 2025 trial, presented a different narrative. Prosecutors argued that ongoing conflict over potty training became the focal point of repeated punishment. Witness testimony established that disciplinary responses had intensified in the days leading up to Anthony's medical crisis. One key witness present in the apartment on March 5th described observing escalating discipline shortly before Anthony's condition worsened. Rather than immediately seeking professional assistance when he first showed signs of distress, Williams attempted to manage the situation privately. Digital forensic analysis became central to the prosecution's case, where records recovered from Williams' phone showed online searches related to medical symptoms. While Anthony remained in a critical state, prosecutors emphasized that no emergency call was placed during this period. When Anthony's condition deteriorated further, Williams contacted his father before reaching out to emergency services. Investigators testified that the delay significantly reduced any possibility of recovery. During questioning, Williams acknowledged hesitation in contacting authorities. Prosecutors characterized that hesitation as evidence of awareness rather than confusion. Medical experts testified that timely intervention during the initial emergency window would likely have changed the outcome. The trial also examined Georgia's Survivor Justice Act, legislation designed to consider mitigating circumstances for defendants with documented histories of abuse. The defense argued that Williams's personal trauma impaired her judgment. Prosecutors countered that, while past victimization can inform sentencing considerations, it does not override a caregiver's legal obligation to protect a child. Judge Asha Jackson agreed, stating that the statute did not apply where intentional conduct and delayed intervention were clearly established. On December 9, 2025, Sophia Williams was convicted of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, multiple counts of cruelty to children, and aggravated battery. In her sentencing remarks, Judge Jackson emphasized that a parent's duty to seek medical care during an emergency is non-negotiable under Georgia law. Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years. The resolution of the Anthony Weiss case became a significant reference point in Georgia jurisprudence, clarifying that failure to seek timely medical care during a known crisis can carry legal consequences equivalent to direct harmful action. Case 7, Brittany Nicole Hall, Georgia. On the morning of November 21, 2021, at the Hometown Studios and Suites on Jimmy Carter Boulevard in Norcross, Georgia, emergency services received what initially appeared to be a high-priority missing child report. 31-year-old Brittany Nicole Hall and her domestic partner, Celeste Owens, reported that Hall's 8-year-old daughter, Amari, had disappeared overnight. Hall told dispatchers they woke around 10 a.m. and discovered the child was no longer in their hotel room. She provided a detailed clothing description for a public alert, stating that Amari was likely wearing a Tweety Bird jacket over blue and white pajamas. Because Amari had been diagnosed with autism, the case was immediately classified as high risk. Gwinnett County Police launched an extensive search operation. Officers canvassed nearby wooded areas, deployed K-9 units, and utilized aerial resources to examine surrounding parks and neighborhoods. In the early hours, investigators treated the case as a potential abduction. However, as detectives conducted follow-up interviews, discrepancies began to emerge in the accounts provided by Hall and Owens. Gwinnett County Police Chief J.D. McClure later stated that their explanations raised early and significant concerns. The direction of the investigation shifted following a forensic examination of a smartphone recovered from the hotel room. Digital analysis uncovered multiple video recordings captured by a concealed device. According to prosecutors, the footage documented ongoing physical mistreatment of Amari and her two younger siblings, ages 5 and 6. Authorities stated that the recordings reflected a recurring pattern rather than a single incident. Prosecutors characterized the conduct as systematic and framed as punishment. Timestamps on the videos established that the behavior occurred over an extended period. Further digital review of Owens's phone revealed internet searches conducted prior to the missing child report. Investigators testified that the searches referenced behavioral control topics and local environmental features, including nearby bodies of water and underground areas. Records also confirmed the rental of a moving vehicle on the same day the disappearance was reported. Using license plate reader data and surveillance footage, detectives traced the rental vehicle to a wooded area in DeKalb County near the Stone Mill Trace subdivision. There, investigators located concealed remains later identified as belonging to Amari. During sentencing proceedings in 2025, medical experts presented findings documenting long-term trauma. Examiners reported both healed and more recent injuries, as well as signs of prolonged neglect. The official cause of death was classified as battered child syndrome, a medical and legal term describing the cumulative effects of repeated physical harm over time. On September 24th, 2025, Brittany Nicole Hall entered a guilty plea in Gwinnett County Court. She pleaded guilty to felony murder, 11 counts of cruelty to children, concealing the death of another, and making false statements to law enforcement. Her defense argued that her relationship with Owens, identified by prosecutors as the primary aggressor, affected her judgment and response. Prosecutors countered that Hall failed to protect her daughter and actively participated in the ongoing harm. District Attorney Patsy Austin Gatson addressed the court, emphasizing that accountability was necessary not only for Amari, but also for her surviving siblings. She described Amari as joyful and affectionate, noting the profound impact her loss had on extended family members. The court sentenced Brittany Nicole Hall to life in prison. The 2025 resolution of the Amari Hall case reinforced a clear legal principle. When a caregiver aligns with harmful conduct rather than intervening to protect a child, the law recognizes that choice as a serious breach of parental duty, regardless of personal circumstances or relational dynamics. Case 8, Letitia Crawford, Illinois. On the morning of August 14, 2002, a maintenance worker conducting a routine inspection behind an apartment complex on the south side of Chicago made a discovery that would remain unresolved for more than 2 decades. Inside a discarded plastic bag, authorities located the body of a newborn infant. The child had no identifying information, no clothing, and no immediate connection to any missing person report. Investigators assigned the temporary name Baby Moses, a designation intended to restore dignity and identity to a case that otherwise consisted only of forensic evidence. The Cook County medical examiner performed an autopsy that same week. The report concluded that the infant had been born alive and passed away shortly afterward due to lack of medical care following birth. There were no signs of external trauma. The case was classified as a homicide related to abandonment. However, with no witnesses and no clear suspect, the investigation eventually went cold. For years, Baby Moses became one of Chicago's most widely known unsolved cases. As advances in DNA technology evolved, the possibility of identification resurfaced. In 2023, with the Cook County Sheriff's Office partnered with forensic genealogy specialists to analyze preserved biological evidence. By early 2024, investigators identified a potential family connection within Illinois. Further analysis led authorities to Letitia Crawford, who had been residing in the Chicago area at the time the infant was born. In April 2024, Crawford was arrested and charged in connection with the case. Prosecutors alleged that she had given birth alone in her residence and later disposed of the newborn's body rather than seeking medical assistance. Court filings emphasized that the infant's death was attributed to failure to obtain immediate postnatal care, not to physical assault. During early court proceedings, Sir Crawford's defense stated that she had been unaware of the pregnancy until labor began and experienced severe psychological distress during the event. Prosecutors acknowledged these claims, but maintained that legal responsibility applied regardless of intent or emotional state. The case reignited public conversation about safe haven laws, which allow parents to surrender newborns anonymously at designated locations without facing criminal charges. Illinois enacted its safe haven law in 1999, 3 years prior to the birth of baby Moses. In September 2025, Crawford entered a negotiated plea to a reduced charge of concealment of a death. As part of the agreement, the homicide count was dismissed, with prosecutors citing evidentiary limitations in the passage of more than 2 decades. At sentencing, the judge described the case as a convergence of isolation, fear, and missed alternatives rather than deliberate harm. Crawford received a sentence of probation along with mandated counseling. More than 23 years after the infant was discovered, the case reached legal closure, though not emotional closure for many involved. Investigators noted that while accountability had been formally addressed, the circumstances underscored the importance of awareness, support systems, and accessible resources for parents in crisis. Baby Moses was laid to rest in a county-maintained grave. Each year, community members place flowers at the site, ensuring that although his life was brief, he is remembered. Case 9, Christy Sheets, Texas. On the afternoon of June 24, 2016, emergency responders were dispatched to an apartment complex in Katy, Texas, after neighbors reported a heated domestic dispute, followed by sudden silence. When Fort Bend County deputies entered the unit, the situation quickly escalated from a disturbance call to a major criminal investigation. Inside were Christy Sheets, age 42, and her husband, Jason Sheets. Their 2 teenage daughters, Taylor and Madison, were discovered inside the residence with life-threatening injuries. Both girls were transported to a nearby hospital, where they later passed away despite medical efforts to save them. Authorities determined early in the investigation that the incident was not accidental and did not involve an outside intruder. Christy Sheets was taken into custody at the scene without incident. As detectives reconstructed the events, they examined the family's recent history. Court records and witness statements described a home environment marked by heightened conflict, strict household control, and emotional strain. Friends and extended relatives later shared that Christy maintained tight oversight over her daughter's activities, education, and communication with others. According to Jason Sheets, the confrontation began as a discussion about future plans and family expectations. He told investigators that the situation intensified quickly. At one point, he left the apartment to seek assistance from neighbors. Prosecutors later established that the events unfolded within a brief but critical period. Evidence indicated that Christy Sheets acted independently. Investigators found no indication of substance influence or involvement by any outside party. During pretrial proceedings, the defense explored mental health considerations, suggesting diminished capacity. However, multiple court-ordered psychiatric evaluations concluded that Sheets understood her actions and was legally responsible at the time of the offense. In November 2017, Christy Sheets pleaded guilty to 2 counts of capital murder. At sentencing, family members addressed the court, remembering Taylor and Madison as intelligent, compassionate young women with promising futures. Under Texas law, the mandatory sentence for the convictions was life in prison without the possibility of parole. In delivering the sentence, the court described the case as a profound breach of parental responsibility and trust. The deaths of Taylor and Madison sparked broader conversations about recognizing warning signs within high-control family dynamics and the difficulty of identifying risk when conflict remains private. The case remains a sobering example of how domestic instability, when left unaddressed, can escalate into irreversible tragedy. Case 10. Mary Alice Locke, Tennessee. Our final case in this series takes us to Allen, Texas, in the suburbs of North Collin County. Unlike many of the cases we've examined, this one focuses on the intersection of parental responsibility and substance use challenges. It centers on 24-year-old Mary Alice Locke and her 8-month-old daughter, Elizabeth. In early 2023, authorities were called to an apartment after Locke reported that Elizabeth was unresponsive. Upon arrival, officers quickly recognized the urgency of the situation. A specialized investigation was launched, involving the district attorney's office and child welfare experts. The inquiry revealed that the household had been struggling with substance use issues. On the evening prior to the emergency call, both parents had obtained medications without prescriptions, and essential childcare routines were overlooked. Investigators determined that Elizabeth had not received timely attention during this period, contributing to the critical outcome. During questioning, Locke admitted that her decision-making had been affected by her personal struggles. She expressed sincere remorse for the events that led to the emergency. The investigation underscored the importance of supervision, timely intervention, and systemic support in preventing such incidents. Mary Alice Locke's case proceeded to trial in 2025, raising important legal and societal questions. Prosecutors emphasized that parents have a legal responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of their children. The defense highlighted Locke's rehabilitation efforts, including completion of substance use programs and parenting courses while awaiting trial. The jury ultimately delivered a verdict that combined legal accountability with probation. The case sparked conversations in Collin County and across Texas about how the justice system addresses situations involving parental challenges and substance use. It also became a catalyst for policy proposals, including the 2025 Elizabeth's Law, designed to provide earlier support and monitoring for infants in at-risk households. The broader impact of these cases is seen nationwide. North Carolina established the State Office of Child Fatality Prevention to centralize data and improve responses for at-risk families. Connecticut passed Mimi's Law, requiring regular check-ins for homeschooled children to ensure their safety. Across these reforms, one clear theme emerges: timely attention and systemic oversight can save lives. As we reflect on all 10 cases in this series, it's evident that parental responsibility is under increasing scrutiny, not because of gender, but because the law prioritizes the safety and protection of children. Programs, early intervention, and community awareness are essential tools for preventing avoidable tragedies. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive with Cold Read Crimes. Your support through likes, subscriptions, and notifications allows us to continue sharing these critical stories while promoting awareness and education. Stay attentive, look out for one another, and take care.